Curiosity by Gary Blackwood. Chapter 1. Out of all the books in the world, I wonder what made you choose this one. Perhaps you're a chess fanatic and you saw that the game figures prominently in the plot. Or perhaps not. It may be that you know nothing at all about chess and care less. You may just be hoping to read a rousing story. In either case, I feel confident that what follows will satisfy you. If that sounds as though I'm boasting, I assure you I'm not. I make no pretense of being a clever or accomplished writer. I'll simply recount the events as they happen to me and trust that they're compelling enough to keep your attention. I suppose I should mention before I begin that there's a certain amount of unpleasantness involved. Every person's life has its dark corners, of course, but I suspect that mine has had more than most. I'm not crying, "Oh, poor me," mind you. I'm only warning you in case you're easily upset. Actually, some parts are more than just unpleasant. There's a good deal of cruelty, as well as poverty, illness, imprisonment, not to mention murder, madness, deceit, obsession, resurrection, unrequited love. In fact, at times it resembles a tale penned by Mr. Dickens or Mr. Poe, though I wouldn't presume to compare my storytelling skills to theirs. The passages concerning chess may mean more if you know a little bit about how it's played. The names of the pieces, for example, and how they move, but even if you're completely ignorant of the game, it shouldn't matter much. I'll keep those bits as simple and straightforward as possible. However little you know about chess, you've no doubt heard of the celebrated chess-playing automaton known as the Turk, unless you've been living in Siberia or darkest Africa for the past several decades. Actually, it wouldn't surprise me to learn that the Turk's reputation has reached Siberia. After all, they say that the Russian Empress Catherine the Great played against him and lost. Certainly, I was familiar with the Turk long before I encountered him in the flesh, or in the wax, I should say, since that was what his fierce, exotic countenance was made of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I know you're curious, perhaps even eager, to learn more about that marvelous and mysterious machine. But if you don't mind, I'd like to begin by telling you something about my life before the Turk entered it. Well, perhaps like is not the proper word. Some of my early experiences are quite painful to recall. Still, I believe they're essential to the story. If you're not a chess fancier, I hope you'll forgive me for starting right off with a scene that revolves around the game. I'll keep it simple and straightforward as promised. I remember clearly the moment when I first saw a chessboard. It must have been sometime around 1826. I know I was not more than 4 years old. At the time, my father, the Reverend Rufus Goodspeed, was in charge of a small but prosperous parish in Philadelphia. Since his duties weren't very demanding, he had plenty of leisure time to indulge his two main passions, natural science and chess. On this particular day, he was playing a game with Father Barry in the library of the parsonage. This was before Philadelphia was swamped by the great wave of Irish immigrants, you know, and people saw no great harm in a Methodist minister keeping company with a Catholic priest. The two made every round of chess into a sort of cheerful crusade. When my father won, he claimed it was because God was on his side, and when Father Barry won, which was rarely, he grew ridiculously righteous. "There, you see, Tobias," he'd say, "you can never keep us Catholics down, we'll always triumph eventually." The library was normally forbidden territory for tots with grasping, grimy hands, but I begged my father so piteously and gave such sincere promises of good behavior that at last he allowed me to enter the sanctum sanctorum under the eye of my nanny, of course. Like Father Barry's Catholics, I always triumphed eventually. I'll be the first to admit that I was a pampered, coddled child. In point of fact, I was spoiled quite rotten, both by my father and by Fiona, my Irish nanny. Mainly, I think it was because I was such a sickly little fellow. According to my father, my birth was a hard one, and the doctors didn't expect me to live an hour, let alone several years. I suspect that in his heart my father resented the fact that I'd survived and that his beloved Lily had not. But he also seemed to see something of my mother in me, and I think that made me precious to him. In some ways, I must have been a difficult child to love. In addition to being sick more often than not, I had a slight deformity of the spine. No doubt a result of being wrenched into the world by a doctor's forceps. I was not a pint-sized Quasimodo by any means, but I had a bit of a stoop. I think I must have looked rather like an old codger in need of a cane. I've been told, though, that my disposition made up for my many indispositions. Despite all that spoiling, I wasn't a demanding child or given to tantrums. By all accounts, I had a sweet temper and a ready laugh and didn't complain much no matter how ill I was or how much my back pained me. Though of course I enjoyed being pampered, I wish now that I hadn't been. It did nothing to prepare me for the hard times that were to come. There I go again, getting ahead of myself. As I said, I was only 4 when I saw my first chess match, but somehow I grasped the essence of the game almost instantly, instinctively. The bumptious Father Barry didn't have the patience to play slowly or methodically, so he insisted on a limit of half an hour per game. I sat utterly motionless through the first game like a cat watching at a window. This seemed to worry Fiona, who sat nearby with her needlework. "Are you feeling poorly, Master Rufus? Shall I take you up to your room then?" She was a good, earnest girl, and as solicitous of my welfare as any mother, but she was not blessed with brains. She could have never understood what I was feeling, even if I could have explained it. I was like a person under the influence of mesmerism, hypnosis as it's now called. The men began a second game. Still, I didn't stir. As my father was about to take his opponent's bishop, I spoke up at last. "No, father, you mustn't. If you do, he'll attack your king with his horse." My father stared at me in astonishment and then at the board. By thunder, the boy's right. Father Barry was clearly peeved at having his clever strategy foiled. "How long's your father been teaching you chess, my lad?" "Is that what it's called?" I said. "Oh, so you're teaching him to lie too, Tobias? He pretends to know nothing about the game when clearly he knows a good deal." My father put a hand to his heart. "Upon my honor, Barry, we've never even discussed the subject." "Then how can he begin to grasp such a complex game? I'm still struggling with it, and I've been playing for 20 years. My father shrugged. "Well, my friend, if you'll pardon the expression, I'd say that God only knows." My understanding of the game didn't seem odd to me, of course. I thought it perfectly natural, like the ability to walk or talk, and I couldn't see why it would take anyone 20 years to become good at it, or in Father Barry's case, to become mediocre at it. Now, of course, I realized that it was a rare gift, one I can't begin to explain. I've had only one other experience I can compare it to. Years later, when I was traveling through Europe, I stopped overnight in a picturesque town in Austria. Its narrow, winding streets were like a maze. And when I went out for a stroll, it took me an hour to find my way back to the inn. But the next morning, I climbed to the top of a tall church tower. With the town spread out beneath me, suddenly I could see clearly where each street led and exactly how to get from one place to another. And that's the way it was with the chessboard. Up close, it appeared to be just a grid of identical light and dark squares. But I seemed able to look at it from another vantage point. I could see patterns, the best way of getting from one place to another. I'm sorry, I promised to keep this simple and straightforward, and here I am getting mystical and metaphysical on you. My father was delighted to find out that he had a bona fide curiosity on his hands. The 1820s and 30s were, above all else, a time of curiosity seekers. Everyone and his brother, and often his sister, fancied himself a budding naturalist. My father was one of the most avid of these amateurs. He was convinced that if he searched long and hard enough, he would discover some previously unknown species, or fossil, or set of bones, and earn for himself a sort of immortality. I think he saw me as a kind of glorified science experiment. I don't mean that he treated me like a laboratory animal. He was always very kind and patient with me, and careful not to overtax my frail body. But from that day on, we spent at least 2 hours each afternoon at the chessboard testing the limits of my newfound skill. There seemed to be no limits. By the time I was 6, I was winning more games than I lost, and when I was 9, he took me to the Philadelphia Chess Club and pitted me against some of the city's best players. I created something of a sensation by defeating most of them. I even showed off a bit, playing 3 or 4 men simultaneously, sometimes with a blindfold over my eyes. I considered this more of a parlor trick than a serious challenge, but it impressed everyone. I loved these outings. They gave me a rare chance to see people and places outside the walls of the parsonage. My father didn't think it was wise for me to attend school. He wouldn't say why exactly, but I know now that he was trying to spare me from the jokes and pranks and torments that are always suffered by children who are different. Though he hired tutors from time to time, most of my education came from his extensive collection of books. I had inherited his avid curiosity, and there probably wasn't a single volume I didn't delve into. My father fed my hunger for knowledge, borrowing or buying books on whatever subject interested me at the time, and many of them were about chess, of course. The best was a manual written by the great French chess master François-André Philidor. It's in the original language, so in order to understand it, I spent a year learning French. When I was 12, my sheltered, privileged life came to an abrupt end. At least it seemed abrupt to me at the time. I realize now my father had been sowing the seeds of his downfall for a long while. Somewhere along the way, his harmless dreams of being a respected naturalist had gotten out of hand. He was paying less and less attention to his duties as a minister, and more to his scientific pursuits, which also ate up a growing amount of his modest income. For years he'd been working on a book that explained, to his mind anyway, how all the different species of animals and plants came to be. He even financed an expedition to South America to gather evidence for his theory. I don't think it ever occurred to him that he was treading on dangerous ground. The church taught that all forms of life had been created exactly as they were. To suggest that they could change all by themselves was akin to heresy. He paid for the cost of printing The Development of Species out of his own pocket, which by now was all but empty. The sales were, of course, dismal. Even worse, the church dismissed him and we had to move out of the parsonage, the only home I'd ever known. Of course, we also had to let poor Fiona go, who was the nearest thing I had to a mother. We were reduced to a single room at a boarding house in Southwark, a neighborhood that was even less appealing than it is today. The streets were strewn with garbage, sewage, dead animals, but it was the live ones you had to look out for, the ill-tempered pigs, some of them as big as I was, that feasted on heaps of foul waste and would just as soon feast on you. The drunken sailors with their smelly tarred clothing and their exotic tattoos, the young toughs who hung around the firehouse hoping for a blaze or a battle with a rival gang to add excitement to their day. Our room and board was only $2 a week, but it was $2 more than we had. My father was forced to sell off his precious library one volume at a time. In the meantime, the collector of South American specimens and the printer of the ill-fated book grew tired of waiting for their money and took him to court. I believe the magistrate, who was also a church deacon, held a grudge against my father, too, because of the ideas contained in The Development of Species. Ironic, isn't it? Though no one bought the book, everyone seemed to know what it said. Rather than give my father a chance to pay his debts, which he surely would have done in time, the magistrate sent him to the debtor's apartment at Arch Street Prison. Don't let the word apartment fool you. It was nothing more nor less than a jail cell, made up of 5 rooms, each occupied by 8 or 10 other debtors of all stripes, from habitual drunks to failed businessmen. Some had friends generous enough to buy them a few amenities, a bed, hot meals, a plug of tobacco now and again. The rest got only 2 scanty blankets and a daily loaf of questionable bread. My father was one of the rest. When he was the respected Reverend Goodspeed, he'd had no shortage of friends. Now they wanted nothing to do with him, not even Father Barry. We had no family to turn to either. My grandparents on the Goodspeed side were Methodist missionaries who'd been living among the Ojibwe people of Upper Canada since before I was born. My father seldom talked about my mother's family, the Raybolds, but I gathered that they disapproved of their little Lily's choice of a husband, and after her death, they'd broken off all contact with us. In all the times I visited my father at his new and Spartan lodgings, he never uttered a word of complaint about his own condition. He thought only about how I was faring, and that was his way. For a minister, he wasn't much good at giving advice, but I've always remembered something he told me when I was very young. I've come to believe, he said, that the secret of life is to accept with good grace whatever befalls you. I would have paid his debts myself, or at least bought him decent food and bedding if I'd known how. But I'd never done a day's work in my life, and in any case, who would hire a weak, sickly boy with no skills except a freakish prowess at chess?